A single legionary eagle, caked in the dry earth of Hispania, tells a story Rome never wanted told. Archaeological records confirm its origin. The standard of a legion officially disbanded a full decade before the war it was found in even began. How did it get here, thousands of miles from where it was last seen, carried into battle against the very Senate that had signed its retirement papers? This is not just a mystery of a lost artifact, it is the first clue in a murder investigation where the victim was the Roman Republic itself, and the killers were its own sons. In the year 80 before the Common Era, the Republic was bleeding from 1,000 cuts, still staggering from the civil war between Gaius Marius and Lucius Cornelius Sulla. Sulla had won. He had posted his proscription lists, a death sentence for his political enemies, their names nailed to the walls of the Forum for any bounty hunter to see. Among those names was Quintus Sertorius, a brilliant soldier, a former praetor, a man who had fought beside Marius and was now marked for death. But Sertorius was not a man to wait for the executioner. He fled, not into quiet obscurity, but into the heart of Rome's most troublesome province, Hispania. Why were the hardened legionaries of a Roman consul, men who had conquered kingdoms, suddenly defecting in droves to the side of this declared traitor? The question haunted the Senate. The answer would shake the foundations of their world. Sertorius arrived in Hispania not as a conqueror, but as an idea. He was a Roman, a proven commander, yet he was an outcast. The Iberian tribes, the Lusitanians, the Celtiberians, had been fighting Rome's governors for decades. They saw in Sertorius not another oppressor, but a weapon. He spoke their language of defiance, but he possessed the mind of a Roman general. He knew their tactics, their discipline, their weaknesses. He understood the intricate machinery of the legion because he had been one of its master mechanics. This fusion of Roman military science with the ferocious, unpredictable guerrilla warfare of the native tribes created something new, something monstrously effective. His first moves were lightning quick, a whirlwind of violence that left the established Roman authorities reeling. He didn't just defeat the provincial governors, he humiliated them, outmaneuvering their legions, luring them into ambushes and turning their own disciplined formations into death traps. He seemed to be everywhere at once, a phantom commanding an army of ghosts. What makes a man betray his homeland? Perhaps the better question is, what happens when a man believes his homeland has betrayed him first? The initial reports reaching Rome were dismissed as provincial squabbles, the usual unrest on the savage frontier. But the dispatches grew more frantic. Governor after governor was defeated, their legions shattered, their authority evaporated. Sertorius wasn't just raiding, he was consolidating. He was forging a nation from the fire of rebellion. He took the sons of the local chieftains not as hostages in the traditional sense, but as pupils. He established a school in the city of Osca where they were taught Greek and Roman rhetoric, philosophy, and, most importantly, the art of war. He dressed them in the togas of Roman senators, treating them not as conquered subjects, but as the future leaders of a new, better Rome. He was building a state, brick by bloody brick, right under the Senate's nose. Roman generals had always built walls to keep the barbarians out. Sertorius was teaching the barbarians how to tear those walls down from the inside, using Roman tools. His army swelled, a bizarre and terrifying mix of Roman deserters, political exiles, and tens of thousands of tribal warriors, all loyal to him and him alone, and him. He understood the power of myth. He was a gifted strategist, but he was an even better psychologist. He cultivated an aura of divine favor. A local hunter gifted him a pure white fawn, a creature of stunning rarity. Sertorius tamed it, and it followed him everywhere, into his tent, into his war councils. He declared it a gift from the goddess Diana, a direct line to the divine. When his scouts brought him intelligence, he would claim the fawn had whispered it to him in a dream. His men, both the superstitious Iberians and the battle-hardened Romans, believed it. They were not just fighting for a general, they were fighting for a man who spoke with the gods. It was a masterpiece of propaganda, a way to unify a disparate force with a single, unshakable belief in their leader's destiny. The Senate was no longer dealing with a mere rebel. They were facing a prophet, a king, a rival consul commanding a shadow republic. The scale of the threat was now undeniable. This was not a revolt, it was a schism. For the first time, a Roman army led by a Roman general and fighting with Roman tactics had carved out a piece of the republic and declared it independent. The news was a shock to the system, a deep tremor of fear that ran through the marble halls of the Senate. The machine of Roman conquest, the unstoppable force that had crushed Carthage and Macedon, had turned on itself. The legions were fighting their own reflection. This war would not be about glory or expansion, it would be about survival. It would be a merciless, grinding slaughter where every casualty was a Roman citizen, every captured standard a mark of national shame. The civil war they thought Sulla had ended had simply moved to a new, more brutal theatre. The men in Rome knew they had to respond with overwhelming force. This was a cancer that needed to be cut out before it metastasized. They couldn't send a mere provincial governor. They needed their best, their most reliable, their most ruthless. They chose Quintus Caecilius Metellus Pius, a man whose very name was a byword for aristocratic stubbornness and traditional Roman virtue. He was a veteran of countless campaigns, a staunch supporter of the late dictator Sulla, and a general who believed in the simple, brutal arithmetic of Roman warfare. Apply more force, more discipline, and more steel until the enemy breaks. He was the hammer of the Republic, and he was being sent to crush the rogue statelet in Hispania before its poison could spread any further. The stage was set for a clash not just of armies but of ideologies. It was the old Rome versus the new, the established order against the radical alternative, a war fought in the mountains and plains of a distant land that would decide the very soul of the Republic. The question of Sertorius is a complicated one. Was he a freedom fighter trying to restore the Republic he felt Sulla had destroyed? Or was he just another ambitious warlord carving out a kingdom for himself? What do you think drove him in those early days? Let us know in the comments if you believe he was a true rebel fighting for an idea, or a clever refugee fighting for his own survival. Your opinion matters because how we read the past defines who we are today. Metellus Pius arrived in Hispania with the full weight and authority of the Roman Senate behind him. He brought fresh legions gleaming in their new armor, their standards held high, a tangible manifestation of Roman power. He was a methodical, old-school commander, a man who believed in fortified camps, disciplined marches, and crushing the enemy in set-piece battles. He was nicknamed the Sow by his detractors, a testament to his slow, ponderous, but implacable nature. He expected to face a disorganized rabble of barbarians led by a desperate exile. He found something else entirely. He found a mirror image of his own army, a force that knew every trick in the Roman playbook because its commander had helped write it. Metellus came to fight a war of conquest. Sertorius drew him into a war of ghosts and shadows. Metellus would march his legions toward a Sertorian stronghold, only to find it abandoned. As he laid siege to an empty town, Sertorius's cavalry would strike his supply lines 50 miles to the rear, vanishing before a response could be mounted. Metellus's greatest strength, the disciplined power of the legion, was rendered useless. How do you fight an enemy who refuses to stand and fight? How do you lay siege to an army that has no city, whose fortress is the entire unforgiving landscape of Hispania itself? Sertorius was not merely a rebel general, he was a revolutionary statesman. While Metellus was mired in the logistics of a frustrating campaign, Sertorius was building his alternative Rome. In the city of Osca, he established a senate of 300 members, comprised of Roman exiles and sympathetic nobles who had fled Sulla's regime. This was not a symbolic gesture, it was a direct political challenge. He was claiming legitimacy. He argued that the true Roman Republic was here, with him, in exile, while the government in Rome was a corrupt tyranny built on the blood of the prescriptions. He minted his own coins, established his own courts, and administered his territory with Roman law. He was creating a state within a state, a project of breathtaking audacity. He was proving that Rome was more than a city on the Tiber. It was an idea, and that idea could be transplanted. This political war was just as important as the military one. Every day his government survived was another crack in the Senate's authority, another testament to their failure. The conflict settled into a brutal war of attrition. Metellus, unable to force Sertorius into a decisive battle, adopted a strategy of terror. He began a systematic campaign of scorched earth, burning villages, destroying crops, and executing anyone suspected of aiding the rebels. He reasoned that if he could not destroy Sertorius's army, he would destroy the land that sustained it. It was a cruel, ugly business, and it backfired spectacularly. The brutality of Metellus's legions only served to drive the local tribes deeper into Sertorius's arms. He was no longer just a Roman general borrowing their strength. He was their protector, their shield against the monolithic cruelty of the Senate's armies. Sertorius, in turn, used this to his advantage, positioning himself as the defender of Hispania against a foreign invader, even as he commanded an army in the Roman style. It was a paradox that only a civil war could produce, a Roman general leading Iberians, defending Hispania from a Roman army sent to pacify it. This long, grinding duel between the two commanders became a personal obsession. Metellus, the personification of the Roman aristocracy, was being constantly outwitted by Sertorius, the upstart from the provinces. The psychological toll on Metellus's army was immense. They were fighting in a hostile country where every shepherd could be a scout for the enemy and every ravine a potential ambush site. Their enemy looked like them, fought like them, and seemed to possess an almost supernatural ability to anticipate their every move. Desertions began to increase, morale plummeted. Metellus, in a fit of rage and frustration, offered a massive reward for Sertorius's head, 100 talents of silver and 20,000 acres of land for any Roman who would betray him, and a full pardon if the traitor was an exile. It was a sign of desperation. The great Roman general had been reduced to offering a bounty like a common gangster. Sertorius, with his characteristic flair for drama, responded by announcing an even larger bounty for the head of Metellus. The war had devolved from a clash of armies into a blood feud between two men. Could you betray your country if you were convinced you were saving its soul? This is the question that must have haunted the Roman officers serving under Sertorius. They were fighting against their brothers, their former comrades, against the very symbols of the republic they had once sworn to defend. Yet, they saw in Sertorius a return to an older, purer form of the republic, before the corruption and the dictatorships. They were traitors in the eyes of Rome, but perhaps in their own minds they were the last true patriots. Their loyalty was not to the Senate of Sulla, but to the ideal of Rome that Sertorius claimed to represent. This internal conflict, this moral ambiguity, is the very essence of a civil war. There are no clear villains, no shining heroes, only shades of grey and the endless grinding certainty of death. The Sertorian War was teaching Rome a terrible lesson, that the most fearsome enemy a legionary could ever face was the man standing in the opposite battle line, wearing the same armor and carrying the same eagle. Metellus built fortifications and waged a war of attrition. Sertorius waged a war of intelligence and morale. He understood that his coalition was fragile, held together by his personal charisma and the promise of victory. He needed to deliver constant, spectacular successes to keep the loyalty of the Iberian tribes and the respect of his Roman officers. He orchestrated daring raids deep into Roman-held territory, capturing supplies, ambushing patrols, and keeping Metellus's legions constantly off balance. He was a master of the small war, the sudden strike, the calculated risk. He never committed his full force unless he was certain of the outcome. He was playing a long game, bleeding the Republic's resources, draining its manpower, and fraying the nerves of its commanders. Metellus came to Hispania to fight a battle. Sertorius forced him to fight 1,000 tiny, unwinnable skirmishes. Metellus controlled the cities he occupied. Sertorius controlled everything in between. The conflict was a meat grinder, consuming men and resources at an appalling rate. But it was a stalemate. Metellus could not pin down Sertorius, and Sertorius was not strong enough to drive Metellus out of Hispania entirely. The war dragged on year after agonizing year. In Rome, the patience of the Senate was wearing thin. Metellus was a reliable bulldog, but he was not winning. The Spanish fire, as they were calling it, was not being extinguished. It was threatening to spread. The reports spoke of Sertorius's growing power, his alternative state, his seemingly endless supply of warriors. Panic began to creep back into the discussions in the Curia. They had sent their best-serving general, and he was failing. The situation required something more. It required a new kind of commander, someone with boundless ambition, a flair for the dramatic, and a complete lack of regard for traditional rules. They needed a man who could match Sertorius not just in tactics, but in audacity. A new player was about to enter the game, a young man who had earned a fearsome reputation under Sulla, a man whose ambition was as vast as the Republic itself. His name was Gnaeus Pompeius Magnus, Gnaeus Pompey. The arrival of Pompey in Hispania was a turning point. He was not like Metellus. He was young, charismatic, and ferociously ambitious. He had been nicknamed Adolescentulus Carnifex, the teenage butcher, for his brutal efficiency in hunting down Sulla's enemies in Sicily and Africa. He did not come to Hispania to fight a war of attrition. He came for glory. He saw the Sertorian War as a stage, a chance to prove that he was the greatest commander of his generation. He brought with him a massive new army, 30,000 infantry and 1,000 cavalry, a force intended to deliver the final, decisive blow. This was no longer a duel between two old rivals. It was now a three-way deathmatch between the old guard in Metellus, the brilliant rebel in Sertorius, and the hungry young lion in Pompey. The stakes were raised, and the rivers of Hispania were about to run red with Roman blood. Pompey, brimming with self-confidence, openly boasted that he would finish the war in a matter of months. He saw Sertorius not as a strategic genius, but as a cornered wolf, and he was the hunter sent to claim its pelt. His first encounters with Sertorius were a brutal education. Pompey was eager for a quick, glorious victory, and Sertorius was more than happy to use that youthful arrogance against him. Near the city of Lauren, Pompey tried to trap one of Sertorius's legions. He was confident in his position, believing he had Sertorius pinned between his army and the city. He even mocked Sertorius's predicament, sending a message that the pupil of Marius should be careful not to get too close to the city, lest he get burned. Sertorius just smiled. He had anticipated Pompey's every move. He had hidden a force in the rear and had laid a perfect trap. As Pompey watched in horror, the legion he thought he was rescuing was completely annihilated. Sertorius had not only won the battle, he had done it right in front of Pompey's eyes, turning his grand maneuver into a public humiliation. To add insult to injury, Sertorius ordered his men not to strip the Roman dead of their gear, a gesture of profound contempt. He was showing Pompey that this was a war between Romans, and he was the superior Roman. The war escalated into a new phase of unparalleled savagery. With two massive Roman armies now operating in Hispania, the scale of the conflict grew immensely. The decisive confrontation came at the Battle of the Sucro River. It was a bloody, chaotic affair, a swirling melee of legion against legion. For the first time, Sertorius and Pompey faced each other directly in open battle. The fighting was personal and vicious. At one point, Pompey himself was wounded, speared through the thigh, and was nearly killed, saved only by the greed of his attackers who stopped to fight over his richly decorated horse. On the other wing of the battle, Sertorius was routing the forces of Pompey's legate. The battle was a tactical draw, a bloodbath with no clear winner, but it was a strategic victory for Sertorius. He had met Pompey's grand army in the field and fought it to a standstill. He had proven that the teenage butcher was no match for him. As the armies withdrew to lick their wounds, Sertorius wryly remarked, "If that old woman Metellus had not been here, I would have flogged the boy back to Rome." This was the nature of the Sertorian War. Victory was indecisive, and defeat was catastrophic. Every battle cost thousands of Roman lives, weakening the Republic regardless of who claimed the field. The soldiers on both sides were veterans, masters of their craft. They used the same formations, the same weapons, the same calls to battle. What drives a man to plunge his gladius into the chest of someone who could have been his tent mate just a few years prior? Is it loyalty to a general, belief in a cause? Or is it simply the brutal logic of war, where the man in front of you is no longer a countryman, but merely an obstacle to your own survival? The war in Hispania was burning away the last vestiges of Roman fraternity. It was normalizing the concept of Romans killing Romans on an industrial scale. The psychic wound it inflicted on the Republic would never truly heal. It was creating a generation of soldiers who knew how to fight their own kind better than any foreign enemy. These men, these veterans of the first great legionary civil war, would one day form the backbone of the armies of Caesar and, ironically, of Pompey himself in the final conflict that would tear the Republic apart for good. The war had become a quagmire. Pompey's arrival had not broken the stalemate, it had only deepened it. Now, two of Rome's most powerful generals were bogged down in an endless, ruinously expensive conflict. Sertorius, for his part, knew he was in a race against time. He could outfight Metellus and Pompey in Hispania, but he could not match the inexhaustible resources of the Republic. He controlled the province, but Rome controlled the world. To win, he had to change the game entirely. He needed to expand the conflict, to find allies, to strike at Rome itself from a new direction. His gaze turned eastward, toward the vast, glittering expanse of the Mediterranean. It was a sea infested with pirates, a lawless domain that Rome struggled to control. And on its farthest shore, a great king, Rome's most implacable and enduring enemy, was watching the events in Hispania with keen interest. Sertorius realized that to save his Rome in exile, he would have to forge an alliance with the greatest enemies of Rome itself. The situation was a paradox of power. Sertorius was winning every major engagement, humiliating Rome's best generals, yet he was slowly losing the war. On the other hand, Pompey and Metellus were losing battles, but had the backing of a global superpower. Who do you think held the true advantage at this moment? Was it the brilliant tactician Sertorius, who was master of the battlefield, or the relentless machine of the Republic, which could absorb endless losses? Share your thoughts in the comments. We are curious to know who you would have bet on. Sertorius, a master of unconventional warfare, made a move that shocked the Roman world to its core. He looked beyond the mountains of Hispania and saw the sea as his next battlefield. The Mediterranean at this time was not the Mare Nostrum, our sea, that Roman propaganda claimed it to be. It was the dominion of the Cilician pirates. These were not small-time raiders. They were a maritime superpower, a highly organized confederation of sailors and warriors who terrorized trade routes, sacked coastal cities, and operated with impunity. They were the enemies of all civilized nations, but Sertorius saw them as potential partners. He dispatched envoys to their strongholds, making them an offer they couldn't refuse, an alliance. He would provide them with military legitimacy and safe harbors on the Hispanic coast. In return, their fleets would become his navy. This was a stroke of geopolitical genius. With a single diplomatic move, Sertorius transformed his provincial rebellion into a maritime threat that could choke Rome's vital sea lanes. He began building his own ships, training his own marines, and launching raids against the Balearic Islands and the coast of Africa. He was no longer contained. He was threatening to set the entire Western Mediterranean ablaze. This alliance with the pirates was a prelude to an even more audacious and, in the eyes of the Senate, more treasonous act. On the other shores of the Mediterranean, in the kingdom of Pontus, sat Mithridates VI Eupator. He was Rome's most persistent and dangerous foe, a brilliant and ruthless king who had fought and lost two major wars against the Republic, but whose hatred for Rome burned as brightly as ever. He was rebuilding his strength, preparing for a third, final confrontation. When news of Sertorius's success reached him, he saw an opportunity. Here was a Roman general, one of their best, tearing the Republic apart from within. Mithridates sent ambassadors to Hispania to propose a formal military alliance. The negotiations were a testament to Sertorius's newfound status on the world stage. He was no longer treated as a rebel, but as the head of a legitimate state. He received the Pontic envoys not as a desperate fugitive, but as a Roman proconsul, seated on a tribunal and surrounded by his Senate. The irony was staggering. The official enemies of Rome were negotiating with a man who claimed to be its true representative. The terms of the treaty were explosive. Sertorius, acting as the legitimate government of Rome, agreed to recognize Mithridates' claims to the kingdoms of Bithynia and Cappadocia, lands that the Roman Senate considered part of their sphere of influence. In exchange, Mithridates would provide Sertorius with 3,000 talents of silver and 40 ships. It was a declaration of war on two fronts, orchestrated by a single Roman exile. For the Senate, this was the ultimate betrayal. Fighting other Romans was a tragedy, but allying with pirates was a crime. Allying with Mithridates, the man who had ordered the massacre of 80,000 Roman civilians in Asia Minor, was an unforgivable sin. Sertorius had crossed a line from which there was no return. He was no longer just a political dissident or a military opponent. He was now, officially and irrevocably, a hostis, an enemy of the Roman people, to be hunted down and destroyed at all costs. The Sertorian War had gone global. It was now intertwined with Rome's larger struggle for imperial survival, a world war of the ancient era. This grand strategy, while brilliant, carried immense risks. Sertorius was now fighting Rome's war on his own terms, but he was also becoming dependent on allies who were notoriously unreliable. The pirates were loyal only to profit, and Mithridates was a distant monarch pursuing his own agenda. More dangerously, his alliances with foreign powers began to alienate some of the Romans in his own camp. They had followed him out of loyalty to their old Marian cause or out of hatred for Sulla. They saw themselves as fighting to restore a better version of Rome. But were they still fighting for Rome when they were allied with its bitterest enemies? Was it possible to save the Republic by consorting with those who sought its utter destruction? The very act of seeking foreign help undermined Sertorius's claim to be the true Roman leader. It was a paradox he could not escape. To win his Roman civil war, he had to act in a most un-Roman way. The war had transformed him. The pragmatic general who had fled Sulla's prescriptions was now a player on the world stage, a kingmaker and a threat to the global order. But this ascent to power came at a cost. The constant danger, the betrayals, the weight of command began to take their toll. He had created a powerful war machine, but he was its only essential component. His entire state, his grand coalition of Roman exiles and Hispanic tribes, was held together by the force of his will, his military genius, and the myth he had carefully constructed around himself. As his power grew, so too did his isolation. A leader who commands such fanatical loyalty must also contend with the deepest envy and the most dangerous ambitions of those who stand in his shadow. The greatest threat to Sertorius was no longer the legions of Metellus or Pompey. It was brewing much closer to home, within his own command tent, among the men who called him brother and commander. The seeds of conspiracy were being sown, not by his enemies, but by his friends. The long, grueling years of war began to corrode the foundations of Sertorius's Rome in exile. Victory in the field was common, but the ultimate prize, a return to Rome and the restoration of their cause, seemed as distant as ever. A deep war weariness set in among his Roman officers. They were exiles, men who had lost their homes, their fortunes, and their families. They had followed Sertorius into the wilderness with the hope of a swift victory. Instead, they found themselves bogged down in an endless provincial war. They watched as Sertorius placed more and more trust in his Hispanic allies, promoting them to positions of command and favoring them in his councils. This was a pragmatic move for Sertorius. The Iberians formed the vast majority of his army, but for his Roman lieutenants, it felt like a betrayal. They were the true Romans, yet they were being treated as second-class citizens in their own shadow republic. Envy, the most corrosive of human emotions, began to eat away at their loyalty. The man who became the focal point of this growing discontent was Marcus Perperna Vento. He was a man of high aristocratic birth, a former praetor who had brought with him the remnants of his own army to join Sertorius early in the war. He was, in theory, Sertorius's second in command, but Perperna was an arrogant and deeply ambitious man who chafed under Sertorius's authority. He believed that he, not the provincial upstart Sertorius, should be leading the rebellion. He saw Sertorius's fame and the devotion he inspired not with admiration, but with a bitter resentment. Perperna began to quietly nurture the dissatisfaction among the other Roman officers, whispering poison in their ears, questioning Sertorius's strategies, and stoking their fears that he was becoming more of a barbarian king than a Roman general. He became the nucleus of a conspiracy, a cancer growing in the heart of the rebellion. Sertorius was not blind to the changing mood. The pressures of command were immense, and the constant threat of betrayal from both within and without began to warp his judgment. The charismatic and humane leader started to become a suspicious and ruthless tyrant. He had always been a strict disciplinarian, but now his justice became harsh and unforgiving. He ordered executions for minor infractions. He began to see plots everywhere. In a particularly brutal and ill-conceived move, he had the children of the Hispanic chieftains, who were being educated at his school in Osca, either executed or sold into slavery, believing their fathers were conspiring against him. This single act of cruelty shattered the trust he had so carefully built with his Iberian allies. The liberator was starting to look like the very tyrants he claimed to be fighting against. Paranoia is the disease of power, and Sertorius had contracted a fatal case. Every hero who lives long enough risks becoming the villain of his own story. The conspirators, led by Perperna, saw their chance. They used Sertorius's increasing harshness as justification for their treason. They convinced themselves that they were not murdering their commander, but liberating the army from a despot. It was the classic excuse of assassins throughout history. They were saving the cause by killing its founder. They began to orchestrate small military defeats, deliberately sabotaging operations to make Sertorius look weak and incompetent. They would then report these fabricated setbacks to him, feeding his paranoia and pushing him toward further acts of cruelty, creating a self-fulfilling prophecy of tyranny. They were setting the stage for his removal, not by challenging him openly, but by eroding his authority and his sanity from within. The greatest war was no longer being fought against Pompey and Metellus. It was a silent, venomous conflict being waged in the command tents and late-night meetings of Sertorius's own inner circle. What transforms loyalty into betrayal? Is it a single act of injustice or a slow accumulation of grievances? For the men who plotted against Sertorius, it was likely a toxic cocktail of both, mixed with a heavy dose of personal ambition. They had once hailed him as a savior, but now saw him as an obstacle. Could you stand by a leader who, in the pursuit of a noble goal, begins to adopt the methods of a tyrant? It is a question that tears armies and nations apart. The tragedy of Sertorius is not just that he was betrayed, but that he may have become the very thing his assassins accused him of being. The civil war was consuming its own children, turning allies into enemies and heroes into monsters. The end was drawing near, not on a battlefield amidst the clash of swords, but in the quiet whispers of conspirators planning a murder. The final act was set not on a field of battle, but at a banquet. The conspirators, with Perperna at their head, devised a simple and cowardly plan. They arranged a feast to celebrate a fabricated victory, a piece of good news they had invented specifically for this purpose. They knew Sertorius, despite his growing paranoia, would not refuse to celebrate with his chief officers, the very men who had been with him from the beginning. The atmosphere was one of forced merriment, of wine flowing freely to mask the tension that hung heavy in the air. Sertorius, perhaps sensing something was amiss, but unable to pinpoint the source of his unease, reclined at the head of the table. He was surrounded by his comrades, men with whom he had shared a decade of hardship, danger, and triumph. He was among friends. He was completely, utterly vulnerable. The signal was a simple, clumsy gesture. The conspirator sitting next to Sertorius dropped his cup. As the commander turned, the man lunged at him, stabbing him with a concealed dagger. In an instant, the banquet hall erupted into chaos. The other plotters drew their own weapons and fell upon the unarmed Sertorius. He was a powerful man, a seasoned warrior even in his late 40s, and he fought back with the ferocity of a cornered animal, but he was one man against a dozen. They overwhelmed him, stabbing him again and again, a frenzy of brutal, intimate violence. The great Quintus Sertorius, the man who had outwitted Metellus, humiliated Pompey, and held a superpower at bay for nearly a decade, died on the floor of a dining tent, murdered not by his enemies, but by his own lieutenants. The rebellion died with him. His last breath was the death rattle of his Rome in exile. The immediate aftermath of the assassination was a catastrophe for the rebels. Paperna, as the chief conspirator, seized command of the army. He had imagined this moment for years, picturing himself as the brilliant successor who would lead them to final victory. The reality was a rude awakening. He possessed all of the ambition of Sertorius, but none of his genius. The Hispanic tribes who had been loyal to Sertorius personally were horrified by the murder. They did not see a change in Roman leadership. They saw a squalid betrayal of the man they had followed as a near deity. Their loyalty did not transfer to Paperna. They simply packed up their belongings and went home. In a matter of days, the vast native army that had been the backbone of the rebellion melted away, leaving Paperna with only a few legions of demoralized Roman exiles. The heart of the movement had been ripped out, and the body was already collapsing. Pompey could not believe his luck. For years, he had been unable to defeat Sertorius in the field. Now his enemies had done his work for him. Faced with Paperna's incompetent leadership and disintegrating army, Pompey moved in for the kill. The final battle of the Sertorian War was a brief, one-sided slaughter. Pompey easily crushed Paperna's forces, and Paperna himself was captured. In a final, pathetic attempt to save his own life, the assassin made Pompey an offer. He claimed to have in his possession all of Sertorius's personal correspondence, including letters from some of the most powerful and respected senators back in Rome. He offered to hand over this treasure trove of treason, a collection of documents that could trigger a new wave of purges and political chaos in the capital. He was offering Pompey the ultimate political weapon in exchange for his life. The decision Pompey made next was perhaps the most brilliant political maneuver of his young career. He took all of Sertorius's letters, the entire archive of the rebellion, and in front of his entire army, he burned them all, unread. He declared that he had no interest in seeing which senators had harbored treasonous thoughts. He was there to end the war, not to start a new one. It was an act of magnificent, calculated magnanimity. It won him immense support in Rome, positioning him as a healer, a statesman who placed the stability of the Republic above political gain. It was also a deeply cynical move. By destroying the evidence, he placed every powerful man in Rome in his debt, forever uncertain if their name had been in those letters. Having demonstrated his mercy, he then had Paperna and all the other captured conspirators summarily executed. There would be no mercy for the men who had murdered their commander. Pompey understood that while treason could be useful, traitors themselves were disposable. The fall of a leader is often a test of the movement they built. In Sertorius's case, his murder revealed a fatal weakness. The entire rebellion was built around one man. Was this a testament to his unique greatness, or a failure to build a cause that could outlive him? Let us know what you think. Was the assassination a simple betrayal born of envy, or was it an inevitable collapse of a movement that was too dependent on its charismatic founder? Tell us your choice in the comments. With the rebellion shattered and its leaders dead, Pompey unleashed a wave of terror across Hispania. The man who had shown such calculated mercy by burning the letters now showed his true face. His nickname, the Teenage Butcher, had been well earned. He swept through the province with fire and sword, determined to erase every last trace of the Sertorian state. Cities that had supported Sertorius were razed to the ground. Tribes that had allied with him were systematically slaughtered. His punitive campaigns were models of brutal Roman efficiency. There were no trials, no negotiations, just extermination. He was not just pacifying the province, he was making an example of it. The message was clear and unequivocal. This is what happens to those who defy the authority of the Roman Senate. Any memory of the Rome in exile, of the alternative republic that had flourished for a decade, was to be buried under ash and bone. The victors, as always, would write the history, and in their version there would be no room for a heroic rebel, only a cautionary tale of a wicked traitor. Pompey's actions in the final phase of the war were a masterclass in Roman power politics. He understood that peace, true Roman peace, was not achieved through reconciliation, but through total annihilation of the opposition. His public burning of Sertorius's letters was a gesture for the Roman elite, a promise that he would not use the war to settle old political scores. His brutal suppression of the remaining resistance was a gesture for the provinces, a stark reminder of the consequences of rebellion. He was simultaneously playing the role of the merciful statesman and the ruthless conqueror. It was a duality that would define his entire career. He was building his political legend, one that was forged in the blood of Hispania. He established trophies and founded new settlements, like the modern city of Pamplona, Pompeo, monuments to his own victory, rewriting the map to reflect his triumph. The ghost of Sertorius was being systematically exorcised from the land. While Pompey was carving his name into the history of Hispania, Metellus Pius, the old general who had borne the brunt of the war for years, found himself sidelined. Pompey's youth, energy, and flair for public relations had eclipsed the slow, steady contributions of the old bulldog. Though they would share a triumph for the victory, everyone knew that it was Pompey who was seen as the true conqueror. It was a bitter pill for Metellus to swallow, but it was another crucial lesson of the new Roman era that was dawning. Victory on the battlefield was only half the battle. The other half was fought in the arena of public perception, and in that arena, Pompey was a master. He had arrived late to the war, suffered several humiliating defeats at the hands of Sertorius, and had ultimately won only because his enemy was murdered by his own men. Yet, through clever maneuvering and ruthless efficiency, he managed to claim the lion's share of the glory. The war was over, the slaughter was done, but the consequences were only just beginning to unfold. The veterans of these long, brutal campaigns, men from both sides of the conflict, began to make their way back into the Roman world. These were not the same soldiers who had marched off to a provincial posting a decade earlier. They were men who had spent years fighting not barbarians, but their own countrymen. They were hardened, cynical, and loyal not to the abstract idea of the Senate and people of Rome, but to the generals who had led them, fed them, and promised them rewards. They had seen firsthand that the Republic was a fragile thing, that a charismatic leader with a loyal army could challenge its authority and very nearly succeed. The Sertorian War had been a laboratory, an experiment in civil war, and its lessons would not be forgotten. The most dangerous legacy of the war was the precedent it set. Sertorius had shown that a province could be turned into a personal power base, a launching pad for a war against the central government. He had demonstrated that legions could be more loyal to their commander than to the state. He had written the playbook that another, even more ambitious Roman would follow a generation later. When Julius Caesar stood on the banks of the Rubicon with his legions, deciding whether to march on Rome, he was walking a path that had been blazed by Quintus Sertorius. The Sertorian War did not save the Republic. It merely provided the blueprint for its final destruction. It was the first deep, shuddering crack in the foundations of the old order. The great civil wars that followed, the wars of Caesar and Pompey, of Antony and Octavian were not a new disease. They were the full-blown symptoms of the sickness that had first taken root in the unforgiving mountains of Hispania. Upon their return to Rome, Pompey and Metellus celebrated a magnificent joint triumph. The streets of the capital were filled with cheering crowds, captivated by the spectacle of captured treasures and unfortunate prisoners paraded before them. For the average citizen, the long, bloody war was over and Rome was victorious. But in the halls of power, a new and dangerous chapter was beginning. Pompey, despite being too young and not having held the requisite offices, used the immense prestige of his victory and the implicit threat of his loyal legions to demand the consulship. The Senate, intimidated and weakened, had no choice but to comply. The old rules of the Republic were being bent, then broken. The ambition that Pompey had nurtured in the Spanish campaigns was now unleashed upon Rome itself. The man who went to Hispania as a general returned as a political powerhouse, a warlord whose personal authority now rivaled that of the state. The war had a profound and lasting impact on the Roman military and political psyche. It had been the first full-scale, protracted civil war fought between Roman legions with Roman commanders on both sides. The taboo had been broken. The unthinkable had become reality. The experience of this conflict created a generation of veterans who were experts in the art of killing other Romans. These were the men who would later fill the ranks of Caesar's Gallic legions and Pompey's eastern armies. When they finally met on the battlefield at Pharsalus, it was not the first time they had faced their countrymen in battle. It was merely a continuation of the brutal education they had received in Hispania. The Sertorian War had been the Republic's training ground for its own suicide. It had accustomed Romans to the idea that the most important political arguments would be settled not in the forum with votes, but in the fields with swords. The lessons learned by the next generation of ambitious leaders were clear and chilling. The career of Sertorius proved that a popular general could command a loyalty that transcended loyalty to the state. The career of Pompey proved that military success, even in a civil war, was the fastest path to absolute political power. The entire episode demonstrated that the allegiance of the legions was a commodity that could be bought with promises of land and gold, and that a general who controlled that allegiance could hold the Senate hostage. The foundations of the old Republic, built on the principle of civilian control over the military, were crumbling. The age of the warlords had begun. The conflict between Marius and Sulla had been a brutal, but relatively brief, power struggle centered on Rome itself. The Sertorian War had been something different, a sustained, ideologically driven conflict that created a viable alternative state and proved the Republic was divisible. As Rome moved forward, celebrating its victory, it failed to recognize the mortal wound it had sustained. The triumphs of Pompey and Metellus were not a sign of the Republic's strength, but a symptom of its disease. The Republic had not defeated a foreign enemy. It had merely succeeded in a particularly bloody act of self-harm. The men who would become the key players in the next generation's civil wars, Caesar, Crassus, Cato, Cicero, all watched the rise of Pompey and drew their own conclusions. They saw that the old ways were dying, and that power now flowed not from the ballot box but from the tip of a legionary's sword. The seeds of the future conflicts that would ultimately kill the Republic and give birth to the Empire were sown in the soil of Hispania, watered with the blood of Roman soldiers. The war was over, but the peace was merely an intermission. This brings us to the central, haunting question of the entire conflict. Who was Quintus Sertorius? History is written by the victors, and for the victorious Pompey and the Senate, he was a traitor, a hostis, a man who allied himself with pirates and barbarians to wage war on his own people. In their narrative, he was a monster, a cautionary tale of ambition gone wrong. This version of the story is simple, clean, and serves the political purposes of those who won. But is it the truth? Or is the truth, as it so often is, far more complicated and uncomfortable? The figure of Sertorius refuses to be so easily dismissed, and his ghost has haunted the corridors of Roman history for millennia, demanding a more nuanced verdict. He remains an enigma, a man whose motives are still debated by historians today, a figure who can be seen as either the Republic's greatest traitor or its last true defender. To his supporters, Sertorius was anything but a traitor. They saw him as the legitimate heir to the Marian cause, the true defender of the old Republican constitution against the tyranny of the dictator Sulla and his oligarchic regime. In their eyes, the Senate in Rome had been corrupted, its legitimacy forfeited through the bloody proscriptions and the subversion of the law. They believed they were not fighting against Rome, but for it. Sertorius's Rome in exile, with its own Senate and its adherence to Roman traditions, was not a rebellion, but a government in waiting, the guardian of the true republican flame until the tyranny in the capital could be overthrown. In this view, his alliances with the Iberians, the pirates, and even Mithridates were not acts of treason, but pragmatic necessities of war, the desperate measures of a legitimate government fighting for its survival against a usurper regime. He was not selling Rome out, he was gathering the strength needed to liberate it. The personal character of Sertorius adds another layer of complexity. Ancient sources, even those hostile to him, paint a picture of a man of great personal courage, military genius, and, for much of his career, remarkable humanity. He was known for his fairness to the native tribes, his efforts to civilize rather than simply exploit, and his deep loyalty to his men. He was a stark contrast to the thuggish brutality of many of his contemporaries. Yet, as the war dragged on, a darker side emerged. The pressure and paranoia led him to acts of great cruelty, most notably the massacre of the noble children at Osca. Does this late-stage tyranny negate his earlier, more noble intentions? Does the hero who becomes a monster in his final days deserve to be remembered as a monster? Or was his fall into cruelty a tragic but understandable consequence of a decade-long war for survival against impossible odds? Ultimately, the Sertorian War's most enduring legacy is the precedent it established. Regardless of Sertorius's personal motives, his war irrevocably demonstrated that a Roman general with a loyal army could defy the Senate, create a personal fiefdom in the provinces, and wage war against the state for years on end. He provided the fatal proof of concept. He showed that the legions, the very tool of the Republic's expansion, could be turned against their master. The Republic had built the most formidable military machine in the ancient world, but it had failed to ensure that the machine's loyalty was to the state rather than to the man holding the reins. After Sertorius, the path was open. The great commanders who came after him, Caesar, Antony, Octavian, were all, in a sense, his students. They learned the lessons of his successes and his failures. The war that was meant to secure the sullen restoration instead created the conditions for its ultimate collapse. It was the beginning of the end. Sertorius lost the war, but his ghost, the ghost of the renegade general, would ultimately triumph, presiding over the death of the Republic he may have been trying to save. Today, looking back across 2,000 years, the final judgment remains ours to make. We are left with the image of a man who was both a brilliant Roman patriot and a commander of anti-Roman forces, a civilizing statesman and a paranoid tyrant, a defender of the Republic, and the architect of a strategy that would lead to its ruin. His story is a timeless tragedy about the nature of civil war, where ideals are corroded by necessity and heroes are ground down into villains by the relentless logic of conflict. So, who do you see when you look at Quintus Sertorius? Do you see a ruthless traitor, a man who, for the sake of his own power, allied himself with his homeland's worst enemies? Or do you see the last true Republican, a man who tried to save the soul of Rome by creating a better version of it, even if it meant fighting the city itself? Write your answer in the comments below. History, after all, does not just judge the dead. Its questions are a mirror in which we, the living, judge ourselves.